Hey, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry for the delay. I wanted to just welcome you to this discussion with the author of Clamor, Berdik. And I want to welcome you to Washington Heights, or Harlem, as some people still call it. How we call it. And again, this event is co-sponsored by the WaHI-Inwood Task Force on Noise. We are a community-based grassroots anti-noise advocacy group that was started back in 2020 to address the issue of excessive noise in our community. And we have since, also expanded to a citywide component called NYC United Against Noise, and to address, because we realized these problems were pervasive throughout the city and not just limited, of course, to Washington Heights. People started reaching out to us because of the advocacy that we were doing to join forces with us. And so we're here to continue this work of educating people about the issue of noise and noise pollution. And as we know, it's been a long journey of years of continually trying to educate people about noise pollution and why it's important, why we should care. And I will again, just so you all know how this is going to work tonight, we're going to have a little discussion up here, and then we're going to open it up to your questions for the author about his book, about what he's found as part of his research. And then we'll have a book signing for those who are interested in purchasing the book and getting it signed by yours truly. So I will now turn it over just for, Chris, if you'd like to just introduce yourself, tell them anything you'd like to say, so open it up, and then we'll get into our discussion.
First, I want to thank Tanya for putting this together.
Off the mic.
You might have to take it off the stand.
I might have. Okay. I want to thank Tanya for putting this together, and I want to thank Sisters Bookshop and Word Up Books for hosting this, and I want to thank everybody for coming out and spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. I don't have, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to kind of leave the preamble at that, and really appreciate it.
Tell them a little bit about yourself, your background.
Yeah, well, I
know it's up there. You can
I'm a science journalist, and right now I'm a freelancer, but I've worked on magazine staffs in the past. I've worked at the Atlantic Monthly, I worked at Mother Jones, which is sort of investigative journalism. I worked writing about science for Boston University for several years. And I mainly write magazine pieces. I also write for nonprofits covering whatever they want me to cover. I've written 2 different books. The first one was about the placebo effect. Basically, it was called Mind Over Mind. And this one is all about noise. And, how I got from placebos to noise is not a straight path, but that's what I've been doing. And the next one hopefully won't take another decade to find that topic.
Thank you so much, Chris. Again, I appreciate you coming to our community. We really appreciate it, having you here. Chris did come, and when he was researching his book a couple years ago, I think we first met out here in the community. So he's been working on his book, as he said, for a very long time. And I just want to jump right into this discussion. And I want to talk about the title, Clamor. How did you, what motivated the title? What inspired this title?
Yeah, so by the time I got to the title, I had already been researching and writing about noise pretty extensively. I wrote several magazine stories that led me to believe that this was worth a book topic. And as I was doing the reporting and the research for those stories, I kind of realized one big problem we're having with noise is that it's actually many different issues. There's many different noise issues that we can talk about. And people often think about it as just one problem. And it's one problem often that's judged just by decibels, how loud things are. But there's noise that is loud enough to damage our hearing. There's noise of distraction. There's noise that causes stress. There's noise that causes sleep disturbance. And all of these different types of noises have different elements to them, have different root causes, and have potentially different ways of mitigating. And so when I thought about all of that, I thought clamor is a synonym for noise that says to me there's everybody's talking at once and nobody's being heard. Everyone has an opinion about noise. Everyone's talking about a different type of noise all at once, and people are talking past one another. And that was kind of the idea I was trying to convey with that title.
I would say you're very accurate, especially in our community. Now, what first drew you to this exploration of noise? You know, you've written about other topics, but what was the moment when you thought, you know, this issue of noise pollution needs further study, further research, further investigation?
So in 2018, I was looking for stories, as I do as a freelancer, looking for things that were interesting to me. And I saw a little write-up in the Harvard School of Public Health magazine about a public health researcher at Harvard named Erica Walker, who was focused on noise pollution. And I hadn't really thought about noise pollution per se, and I hadn't thought about it as a health issue at that point. I just thought noise was something that bothered me sometimes, it bothered other people other times. I think noise, to me at that point, was how a lot of people think about it. It's an individual issue. But she was looking at all these health impacts. I started to research them, looking at the epidemiology related to noise. And so you could look at the hearing impacts, which is one of the better known impacts. But then you have the increases in risk of cardiovascular disease, the increase in risk of stroke. You have the trouble with learning and childhood brain development. You have downstream impacts from hearing loss like dementia, depression. You have impacts like diabetes. You have these impacts in the hospital where clinicians get so worn out from all the alarms that they stop responding as fast as they ought to the real ones. And it was amazing to me that there were these huge impacts from a source that many people can't agree on what the definition of it is. So that kind of, that juxtaposition, made me interested in finding out more. I did more magazine pieces. I did a piece for Popular Science about noisy restaurants. I did a piece for High Country News about noise in nature, another aspect of noise I don't think people think about. And I did got a grant to go to India and talk to noise activists there. And it just kept being interesting to me, this topic. And so for that, I thought this is probably worth a book exploration.
And how long ago was that when you started this journey?
Yeah, so 2018 was the initial interest, and then at the very end of 2019 is when I got the book contract, and I was getting ready to start doing the serious reporting for this book in early 2020. And if we can cast our minds back to what was going on, something happened. And it made me have to pause everything for about 18 months. But that allowed me to think more and more about this topic. I was reading more about it, thinking about what I wanted this book to say and what the argument was going to be. I met Tanya in early, I think it was 2021, just after, she was getting ready to face another summer of fireworks. And so, and really didn't get started again on the reporting until late 2021, 2022. Then I wrote about 100,000 words, which that translates to about 400 pages. That was my first draft. Luckily for everyone, it was revised. I revised it 3 times. Now it's about 55,000, something around there. It's pretty readable. I think it's pretty slim boy.
It's a very, very good book, by the way. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about your journey, gathering research. Where did you start? When you think about noise, where do you even begin? How do you decide? What city do I start in? Where do I begin this work? What angle am I going to take in terms of the research? Tell me a little bit about that process.
Sure. This story will end up having me, I'm going to read a little bit from this book, which is a rare treat for a nonfiction writer to be able to actually do a little bit of reading. It will be a couple of vignettes that I want to read. from some of the reporting that I did. But generally speaking, I started local. I started with this Harvard researcher from Boston, and met up with her, did the literature review of her interest in public health, started to collect any regular lay press about noise that I could find, and then I started to get these assignments from other magazines that allowed me to travel a little bit to experience places, because doing interviews over the phone or by Zoom, and you're talking about a topic like noise, it's just not enough. You need to be on the ground. So, sort of a recap, I went to Vancouver, and I went to Seattle, and I went to India, and some of these things were grant funded, some of them were funded by the magazines, and by the time I got deep into the book writing, some of them were funded by me. But at a certain point, it's everything all at once. I started to collect all this information, started to make file folders of, noisy restaurants, city noise, alarm fatigue, noise in nature. And one room of my house is dedicated to basically piles of literature and paper and interview transcripts. But being on the ground is very important. One place I went was Detroit. And I went there because there was a group that was basically suing these people that were building a new bridge over to Canada that was going to supplement the existing bridge that is one of the most traveled international trade routes between the US and another country. Yeah, right. We'll see what happens. But there's a neighborhood called Southwest Detroit. It is a small residential neighborhood, small streets, houses, chalk block, and the trucks that are going from the train terminals across the bridge cut through it rather than get on the highway because they don't want to deal with the highway traffic. So you have these 18-wheelers, one after another, rolling down these streets, spewing not just noise, but all of their particulate matter, all of their noxious fumes, vibrating the mortar in these porches and houses. All day, once a minute, one of these trucks comes by. Sometimes at night, when these trucks are still coming by, even though they're not allowed to. And so we're going to build this new bridge. It's going to make even more truck traffic through this neighborhood and other neighborhoods nearby. And a community group got together, fought them in court, and they got money to do two things: either add sound insulation to new windows, kind of like the FAA does for some communities underneath the flight paths, or move people from an affected neighborhood to a new place in the city. Detroit has a lot of vacant houses that they can refurbish. So they got the money to refurbish a house somewhere else in the city, and they would move people. So I'm going to read two vignettes. One is from the neighborhood that has trucks rolling through it once a minute, and the other is from the nearby neighborhood where a lot of people have been moved out to a different part of the city. And I'm reading them because it's the same forces at work causing very different sonic impacts on neighborhoods that are right next to each other, pretty much. One's on one side of the highway, one's on the other. So I'm going to try to. Really? It's going to take me a bit. Actually, I might be able to. About once a minute, the global economy roars past Thomasenia Weston's modest brick house on Livernois Street in Southwest Detroit. All day and into the night, a cavalcade of 18-wheelers hauling tankers and shipping containers for international logistics firms such as Hapag-Lloyd and HMM roar and rumble past her residence. The trucks emit billowing clouds of soot, darkening windowsills that once were white. I don't normally sit out here. It stinks, Weston said, as we settled into folding chairs on her front porch one warm summer morning. She glanced at her dirty windows. I just power washed those last month. Southwest Detroit, often known simply as Southwest, is among the city's lowest income neighborhoods. It's home to about 45,000 people, the majority of whom are Hispanic. About a quarter are African American, like Weston, who has lived here for 20 years, raised 2 kids, and serves as the guardian for 2 grandchildren. The predicament Weston and her neighbors face is far from unique. Across the United States, transportation and industry noise disproportionately burden those who are least able to escape the din and have less green space to buffer it. In one of the first rigorous reckonings with our national noise gap, a 2017 study by public health researchers from the University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard found that the richer and whiter a census tract grew, the quieter it became. A 2020 audit of transportation noise nationwide covered similar inequities, as have local noise exposure studies from cities such as Minneapolis, Atlanta, and multiple cities in California. Meanwhile, an analysis of environmental noise occurring near some 94,000 schools located throughout the United States found that those with higher proportions of students who were non-white or whose families had lower incomes endured far more noise from traffic and overflights. Back in Southwest Detroit, river noise is 2 lanes divided by a dashed white line, and is clearly not built for heavy traffic. The street is chock-a-block with houses much like Weston's, with its chain link fence enclosing a small front yard, where a lone rose bush defies the crabgrass. Yet the neighborhood is sandwiched between interstate freight distribution centers and railways. It's also only a couple miles from the Ambassador Bridge over the Detroit River, a major trade artery between the United States and Canada. As a result, Livernois and nearby streets are favorite cut-throughs for trucks looking to bypass the clogged highways. Commercial truck traffic between Detroit and Canada has grown steadily since the North American Free Trade Agreement took effect in 1993, rising to about 10,000 daily border crossings, which spill into the residential streets of Southwest. A recent neighborhood count of trucks taken by local activists and public health researchers at the University of Michigan tallied about 1 commercial vehicle per minute at multiple locations. The same research partnership spawned a 2021 study of truck noise in Southwest, which tracked data from more than 20 locations around the neighborhood over several days. They found that daytime noise at sites facing the street sometimes topped 100 decibels. So I don't know if you're familiar with the decibel scale, but and averaged about 75 decibels, about the same loudness as a vacuum cleaner. The noisiest sites were nearly 20 decibels louder than the 3 quietest ones, which were tucked in backyards away from the busiest roads. They were also only 5 decibels quieter at night. So that's Southwest. Now, and this is Delray. Initially an autonomous riverside village, Delray was annexed to Detroit in 1906, and it boomed along with the city's industry. In the 1920s and 30s, a loud and vibrant Delray was home to some 24,000 residents, African American and immigrants from Poland, Hungary, and Mexico, and Ireland. Many worked in the local factories and patronized the shops, restaurants, and bars lining the neighborhood's main drag, West Jefferson Avenue. But by the end of World War II, Delray's decline had begun. The downturn accelerated in the 1960s and 70s as families moved out and more heavy industry moved into the neighborhood. Moved in, and the neighborhood was soon dominated by steel and cement plants, a wastewater treatment facility, a coal-fired power station, an oil refinery, not to mention the train yards and the massive highway cutting Delray off from the rest of the city. By 2015, when the city authorities started forcing buyouts and demolishing houses to make room for the planned bridge, that's the new one, and Customs Plaza, only about 2,000 Delray stalwarts remained. Under the terms of the home swap program, the name Delray became synonymous with environmental degradation, with the highest Delray scores determining who got dibs on residences elsewhere in the city. A Delray score was based on an accumulation of points that took into account a home's proximity to the new bridge and the number of years its owners had lived in the neighborhood. People earned more points toward their Delray score if they had kids, if they were elderly, or if a doctor could attest to a medical condition making them especially sensitive to air or noise pollution. By the time of my visit, Delray had shrunk to about 300 households, and nature had already reclaimed the place. In contrast to the densely packed streets north of the highway, much of the neighborhood resembled a prairie with sidewalks. Entire blocks were nothing but a street sign and a fire hydrant poking defiantly above the wild grasses and patches of purple thistle, goldenrod, and Queen Anne's lace. With almost no cars rolling down the cracked streets, no pedestrians, no kids chasing each other around the playgrounds, nor any of the usual urban hustle and bustle, it was certainly quiet. In fact, when a quick burst of birdsong rose above the dull traffic rhythms of the still distant highway, it was almost peaceful. Nevertheless, the eerie quiet of loss was unmistakable. Nowhere were the complexities of fighting noise pollution more evident than here. The forces inundating Southwest Detroit with nonstop cacophony had also foisted this desolate stillness on Delray. Noise is rightly understood as a pollution, toxic byproduct of modern life that's responsible for widespread, albeit unequal harm. But the antidote to too much noise will never be as straightforward as it is with other pollutants, for which less is always better and zero is ideal. Ultimately, people want sonic surroundings that reflect a healthy, empowered, and prosperous community, and those goals can't be easily plotted on a decibel chart. Closer to the river, Delray's vacant lots were backed by black silt fencing, beyond which mountainous piles of earth, beyond which rose mountainous piles of earth on the edge of the bridge's 165-acre construction site. Just offshore on Zook Island, the hulk of a steel mill that had idled most operations in 2020 stood like a rusty skeleton against the gray sky. Nearby rose the grim smokestacks of a coal-fired power plant that had belched thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides into Delray's air every year for more than 6 decades before finally shutting down in 2021. The construction site was idle that day, and only 2 massive concrete towers, one decorated with a painted bald eagle and the other with an American flag, hinted at the future presence of the new bridge. The towers were surrounded by cranes, backhoes, and other earth-moving equipment, and 2 towers mirrored them on the Canadian side of the river. Nothing lay between them yet, except empty air and a massive silence. It felt as though the place had just taken a very deep breath and was awaiting the din to come.
Very compelling, and I was struck myself when I was reading that about the connection between other forms of environmental injustice and predominantly minority, immigrant, poor communities and noise pollution. So that was very educational. And in your book, you discuss a little bit about that in terms of the connection between those 2 things. And you mentioned that it's because these communities, lack power to fight back, and so that poses a great, obstacle to being able to solve these problems. And that's what I find up here. I can speak from experience in this community that it's very hard to fight. You don't have significant or efficient resources to do so. So I do appreciate you bringing out that connection. And also in keeping with that, I wanted to find out in doing your research, going to different cities, different countries, what were some of the things that stuck out in terms of differences in terms of the state of noise pollution in those places, or even similarities in terms of noise pollution in those places?
So every noise situation is unique in some ways. When I came here to visit, it was the first time I'd ever had to dodge a mob of dirt bikes and ATVs coming down the street on the sidewalk. But subsequent to coming down here, I read about similar issues in other cities, in Baltimore and in Philly and in others. So there are these things that make the place unique, but they're often shared. Vehicle noise is something that is everywhere you go. But then I went to India, and the vehicle noise there puts vehicle noise in New York to shame. The loudest city in Maharashtra, which is the sort of state that Mumbai is in, is a little town called, it's not a little town, it's a city called Ulhasnagar, and they measured the traffic noise there averaging 90 decibels. And they honk a lot. They honk because it's part of the culture of driving there to honk rather than to put on your turn signal, rather than to, slow down. And because there are actually, the cities are often not constructed well so that you have people have to walk in the streets. And there's just not the proper infrastructure there. But again, you have similar types of issues here in New York. You have similar types of issues in Europe. One thing that's different in Europe that is, I think I appreciate, is that they look at noise as a collective problem. I think we've lost that here. I think we think about it mainly as if the noise is bothering you is your problem. The noise is bothering me, okay, that's my problem. In Europe, they have a law to write a 5-year noise plan if you're a city of a certain size. So you track the noise, typically from transportation, maybe heavy industry as well. And then they sort of say, well, here's our plan to deal with these noisy hotspots. And they also look at quieter areas and say, here's our plan to protect these quieter areas. But again, they still only look at decibels. So they still have a kind of a very narrow way of understanding what the noise problem might be and what the solutions might be.
Yes, thank you so much for that. You also communicate here in terms of Washington Heights and Inwood. We were doing some research in our community. Tell me about that experience here. Was there anything that stuck out in your mind in terms of what we're dealing with in this community that's pretty unique, or that was particularly challenging, that you think is particularly challenging in terms of advocacy to sort of deal with the problem of noise pollution specifically in this community?
I mentioned the ATVs that I jump out of the way of, but the other thing that was interesting at that time was this was just coming on the heels when everything I read about in the popular press was about how things were so quiet. There's the COVID hush. We can hear all these birds. This is amazing. As terrible as the cause is, like this is one, the sonic effect of it is this quiet, and we're really appreciative of it. But then, I read about, Tanya's advocacy, and not here, not where the fireworks are going all night, and people are trying to work double shifts and trying to sleep, and people are spilling out on the streets for parties essentially, and that, however, was not unique to here either. This was also in LA. That was a big problem. All-night fireworks, and in Boston, where I live, in certain neighborhoods, it really mattered where you were, what the sonic impacts of that period was. So again, there were things that are unique, but not. I wouldn't say that when I came here, there were things that I had subsequently, didn't encounter elsewhere. I'd actually want to know from your experiences, what you think might make the noises here or the noise challenge here unique. You probably talked to a lot of people in other cities that are dealing with similar issues.
Yes, keep that in mind when we get to the Q&A. Definitely would like to discuss that. I did want to kind of circle back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of the correlation between lower income communities, minority communities, and noise pollution and other forms of environmental injustice. What is it that communities who face that, how insurmountable will this problem be? Are they looking at a continual fight for justice? Or are things looking better? Or are there more opportunities for them to have a voice in this? What does it look like in the future for communities like this who are facing these sort of issues?
I have a fairly limited experience. Obviously I did write this book, but I didn't. I talked to you. I talked to some folks in Seattle. Talked to some folks in Jackson, Mississippi, and what you find is that the same things that are causing extra noise exposure are also causing exposure to many other different pollutions. These trucks that came through Detroit, they are leading to some of the or exacerbating the high asthma rates of the people there, especially the kids. And so you look at what's the cause of this, the root causes of it. And you have to look back to redlining. You have to look back to these historical forces that led to these places becoming, the communities of least resistance. And so it's hard to think about just dealing with the noise in isolation there and thinking that we're able to solve the noise without getting at the root of it. And that's a much, much bigger lift. But I will say that some of the more promising things that I heard about was like a group in Seattle called El Centro de la Raza. They are a group there, a community group that has a environmental justice director named Mariola Batoyola. And what they've done is actually taken the noise issue, because they're in a neighborhood that has overflights from 2 airports that are right next to them. They have a interstate to their east, or to their west, and to their north. And then they have rail tracks to their east. And so they are inundated, and they've decided to join the noise issue with the air pollution issue, with the lack of green space in their neighborhood. And they've called it Fix the Harm. I might just read a tiny bit. I'll mention some of the success they've had. They've been able to get the state of Washington to do an environmental justice review of citing major infrastructure and to understand the cumulative impacts that those, wherever they want to cite this stuff, has endured thus far. They partnered with the City Parks Department to save about 100 acres of trees that were buffering the noise and the pollution from Interstate 5. And they have been able to get the SeaTac airport to have bi-weekly or bi-monthly regular meetings with citizens groups. They convinced them to stop doing the nighttime flights after a certain hour. There were a lot of cargo flights going to Asia that they stopped, or at least made them go at different times. So here's just a paragraph. Joining with other community groups under the slogan Fix the Harm, El Centro de la Raza has pressured congressional representatives, thus far unsuccessfully, to push for expanding the funding of overflight noise mitigation beyond the 65 decibel perimeter for neighborhoods highly impacted by multiple types of pollution. The noise, the air pollution, the loss of trees, the long-suffering river, that's the Duwamish River, became kind of like a industrial estuary where all the factories that were there with Boeing and others just sort of dumped stuff into it. So they're now cleaning that up. The noise, the air pollution, the loss of trees and a long-suffering river cannot be treated as separate causes, according to Batoyola. We want our health, she said. It's all intertwined. And I think that's important. I think recognizing that noise is not a standalone issue, everything that we could do to kind of say, to think about, to care about cardiovascular disease, to care about the learning environments of our kids, to care about chronic stress, to care about environmental justice, to care about the environment itself, is to care about noise, gives much more leverage to this issue.
I totally agree. At one point, the city of New York enacted a environmental justice commission on environmental justice. And one of the things that, we've been trying to advocate for is the inclusion of noise pollution. Because it was totally left off the list. This was very interesting.
Yeah.
It's just like maybe a few years ago, 2 years ago, when this was established, I believe.
Yeah.
And so you're actually correct. I mean, being able to see how these things are related and why they should be in the same discussion is something that I think all communities need to think about, for sure. Now I want to circle back to something else that you mentioned before we get into some of the other questions about noise. You do a great job and spend a lot of time really talking about what noise is, how it has historically been defined, and how it should be defined, as well as how it should be measured, how it has, historically been measured with decibel and new ways of thinking about noise. I think that's important for us in terms of education, because people ask, what exactly is noise pollution? What do we mean? And can you talk a little bit about that in terms of how noise has been historically defined, how it's been historically measured, and why those things differ and change?
So the canonical way of understanding noise is through decibels, and decibels were introduced by Bell Labs. They were using this measurement to measure how the signal over their telephone lines, this is in the 20s, how the power of the signal dissipated over miles and miles as they were putting up these telephone lines across the country. So they had this measurement, and it was basically a measurement of power. It was a measurement of acoustic energy intensity that they then gave to, they allowed their technicians to use, who were hired by the New York City Health Department in 1930 to go drive around the city in a truck and take measurements of noise, and they measured it by decibels. And their report led to the first noise code in the United States, the New York Noise Code, and it was based on decibels. And this just became the way to understand good sound from bad sound. It was this many decibels, it was bad. If it was below that, you could basically ignore it. And it became powerful because it's one number. It's a very simple metric, but the way I think about it is to understand noise just by its loudness it's like the blind men trying to figure out what an elephant is just by whatever bit of it that they can touch. You have the acoustic aspects of a sound, from frequency and pitch to timbre, rhythm. You have psychoacoustic pieces of it. So there's a term called tonal noise, which is if you have a noise that has a whole lot of energy in one particular pitch range, like a high whine or a low rumble, the kind of thing you feel in your chest. That's a tonal noise, and that has a distinct impact on people, especially the low decibel kind, because low decibels can travel farther than high decibels. They can penetrate walls easier than high decibels. So they're a lot harder to deal with. And also low decibels are not counted when we talk about the typical rating of a decibel in the noise code is an A-weighted decibel. And it's essentially the range of frequencies that are the sweet spot for human communication. And it discounts the high stuff, it discounts the low stuff. So the things that bother people are not necessarily even counted in the decibels themselves. And then you have context. That's the big one. This is sort of, where are you when you're hearing this noise? What are you trying to do we love bird song when we're out on a hike, going for a walk. It's part of our kind of getting away and natural reverie. But people have tried to use bird song as like a biophilic element in like an indoor soundscape in offices. People hate it because they don't want to hear a bird when they're trying to, do their work. But so it's the same sound, obviously, but much different context. Context of, is it at night? That one we kind of got a handle on, but not really. And then does it ever stop? So there's a big problem now with data centers, which I don't write about in this book, but I've been hearing a lot more and more about them. These data centers they have a cooling that they have to have for their for their servers, because if they don't cool them, they burn up and all the data is lost. So they have to be air conditioned and cool all the time. And so this tonal noise is emitted out into the neighborhood 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and people can't escape it. And so that's another big piece of it. So there's all these elements that come to bear on what makes sound noise. And I think a lot of it can be kind of encapsulated in what is the goal of the space that we're talking about? What is the goal of a school? What is the goal of a restaurant? What is our goal when we are at home trying to sleep? What is our goal when we're in a hospital, either trying to heal or trying to help people heal? And does that sound, I call it, well, not just me, the soundscape, all the sounds in that environment, make those places function better, help us reach those goals, or do they hinder them? And I think that's a new way of thinking about how to define noise. It's harder, it's complicated. People will argue about it, but they already do. But that, I think, is something I was talking to some people working on tools and processes to kind of help people think about noise in that way.
Yeah, I think those were some very provocative points that you made about noise. That was very educational for me in terms of thinking about this, because in our community, we really are focused on the decibel level. It's, we have our own, we use our own pocket, sort of like individual, like little noise apps that can measure decibel level. So to see, to think about this in a new way is very interesting. And I was, one of the things that I thought was interesting in your book is when you mentioned, nevertheless, our ultimate goal shouldn't be a snake-free garden, or for that matter, a noise-free world. Instead, we should listen more and think seriously about the sounds of the shaded places we want to create. So how to create environments, that nothing's going to be free of noise, but how can we as communities, control and have a voice in what the soundscape will be in our communities.
I have a couple examples of this, and much of that is obviously very aspirational, and it's not, as people might think, aiming for some correct soundscape anywhere, but it is a way of considering sound in the design of places. I often talk about a park near my house, which was reclaimed from an overpass going over a highway that was just this ugly concrete slab, maybe about a couple acres in total. And they recently put a bunch of sod on it, and beautiful pathways and lighting and benches, and it's gorgeous. But nobody goes there. Nobody hangs out there. And the reason is because there's nothing that they did to mitigate the sound of either the highway underneath or the 4 lanes of traffic that are surrounding. And I saw the same thing happen in Brighton, England, where there's a much older park that has at the north end of it 4 lanes of traffic with a bus stop. And so this bus comes, wheezing in and stops there and idles for a couple minutes. And at that end of the park, it's totally vacant. As you go deeper, and there's sort of a natural landscaping that blocks the sound, there's more trees. There's a water fountain that has a masking sound. Then you have people sitting at the benches, having their lunch, talking to each other, walking their dogs, laying out in the grass. The function that you want this park to have is impacted severely by what the sonic environment is. So that's the kind of thing that Tanya was referring to.
Yes, and in Washington Heights and Inwood, we have some beautiful parks, numerous beautiful parks, but they're ruined because of the soundtrack that goes along with them. So I definitely understand that. I'm sure the community definitely can appreciate that as well. Now, people have been concerned about noise for decades. As you mentioned, this goes way back in terms of the federal government trying to make some inroads and educate people about noise. But why do you think it has taken this long for the issue to finally start getting some traction? Because when we first started doing this work, people didn't take it seriously at all. We were just a bunch of Karens who were, just annoying people. And what happened? What was the shift? Because I'm starting to see more news articles about it. I'm starting to see more people talking about it. What do you think shifted?
My speculation, I have two thoughts on it. One is that due to the technology that we now have with the noise canceling headphones and the earbuds, the AirPods too, and et cetera, that streams whatever we want into our ears whenever we want it. I think there's been a change of expectation for how much control we should have over what's coming into our ears. I think that's one thing. It may have been kind of multiplied by the changes in how we were living during COVID. We were much more aware suddenly of all the sounds around us, either because there was this hush or because we were now having to live at home and work at home with our spouses, and our kids were going to school at home, and we realized how much noise impacts our lives. But I actually think another one that's really important is that we now have increasingly a digital cacophony to deal with. Our overstuffed inboxes, all of the scrolling that we're doing constantly, the push notifications from our phones. Some of these things make sound, some of them don't, but they count as noise in the same way that any audible noise might, that is like a signal that your brain is trying to handle and sift through. So I think those things are cumulative, and we all have our limits in terms of what our attentional bandwidth can handle, and all of those things that go over that limit, add to our stress. I think people recognize that. I think that is something that is also driving concern.
Thank you. So, when you, in the course of doing your research for this book, did you count any pushback from communities or from people in the course of doing research for your book? And I know that was one of the things in which you quoted me was about some of the resistance that some communities that are also facing issues of being silenced, and how the issue of noise abatement becomes like this battle between we want to be heard and feelings of being another attempt of silencing those communities. But did you face any pushback or any negativity in terms of doing this work? And if so, how did you kind of deal with that?
No, I kind of got off lucky. I mean, I did encounter pushback. I did have a lot of people that didn't want to talk to me because they figured they knew what I was going to say about them ultimately. I tried to get in touch with some folks who do ride dirt bikes and ATVs, and they didn't want to have anything to do with me. The main pushback I got, there were a few different levels of it. One would be people who thought, why are you even bothering about this issue? There are so many bigger issues out there. Why should I care about noise? That's one thing I got. Another thing was sort of, well, okay, but I really like loud things. I love, my Harley when I rev it up. I love the, you name the music. I love it, the louder the better. Or, I've lived my whole life in the city, and when I go to the country, it's too quiet. I can't stand it, can't sleep. Um, the overall message there is that to be concerned about noise is to be for some homogenized, single, suburban, quiet soundscape, and that's it. It's either that, you let people live your life, or you got to enforce, shady oaks on everybody. And the way I tried to deal with it is to say, what I'm trying to write about here is sonic quality. What I enumerated before about what we want from the soundscape in our hospital, in our school, in our restaurant. It may be different things, but to think about it up front. So when you were designing your school, or excuse me, the best example I have is designing a restaurant. So back in the 90s, people thought, let's get rid of all of the drapes and carpets, upholstery. Let's bring the kitchen out from back there and put it in the middle of everybody. Let's crank the music up. And they were aiming for something that they just way overshot. They were aiming for this, energetic, industrial, or modern vibe. And what ended up happening is that people couldn't talk to one another. This very important piece of being with one another in a social setting, sharing a meal together, you just couldn't do it. You couldn't hear one another. And so what I'm optimistic about is that there's now technology that allows people to create a 3D model, an immersive auditory model of a restaurant or another space by essentially putting in the parameters of the room, the dimensions of it, the reflective qualities of the materials being used, the types of sounds that are going to be frequently heard there. And then you can sit there and experience this place before it's built. And then you can say, is this what we want? And perhaps it is. Maybe you want to blow everybody's doors off when they come in to eat, but maybe you don't. Maybe you want something that, is more friendly to having people come down and talk to one another. And so I think, I tried to impress upon people that what I'm arguing for in this book is not just quiet. It's not just one answer. It's a process and a way of thinking about sound that I think we've overlooked, that we've just been, sonically short-sighted for too long. And I think also, two things to be true. You can have noise complaints correlated with gentrification. You can have places like Washington, D.C., where they were trying to drive the go-go music out of existence, and the people that were trying to rally to save that actually rallied to save many, many other things in their neighborhood. And that doesn't mean that people aren't being kept awake by all the ATVs and other things coming down the street at night. So those two things can both be true. So I was trying to kind of thread that needle.
Yes, it's very complex for sure. We just have a few more questions and we'll open it up for your questions. One of the things that I noticed in the book, I not sure it's because they just probably didn't want to talk about it, but one of the things, there was a lack of voice from the government, from government, in terms of their thoughts on noise and their plans to help mitigate noise and what their role has been. You talked about earlier the federal government, some of its roles and how it just sort of dissipated somehow. But why do you think, what should be the role of government? What has been the role of government? What should be the role of government? Can they play an important role in noise, in the discussion about noise pollution and what to do about it?
they can play an important role. It's hard to say exactly what that role would be, but I will explain what role the federal government used to have. Back when the Environmental Protection Agency was first created by President Nixon in the early 70s, one of the first offices that was part of the EPA was the Office of Noise Abatement and Control. So that office did many different things. It funded research into noise and noise impacts. It tried to certify certain products, power tools or motorcycles, and create regulations about how much noise they could create. It also had these technical assistance centers that were set up around the country to help local and state authorities have the expertise to deal with noisy issues in their communities. So now when you have a noisy issue in your community, oftentimes your local folks, I think New York is pretty decent as they go, but local people don't know anything about it. They're not trained even to use the decibel meter. The local noise codes are typically about, individual nuisance. They don't acknowledge public health issues related to the noise. So what happened with the Office of Noise Abatement and Control was that it did a lot of work, spread a lot of information about noise and the health impacts. And then when Reagan came into office, it was just cut. Actually, the office still's there, but it has no money. So the leadership, I think the most important thing that I see is that the leadership that it provided is gone. There is no longer, I mentioned Europe, there's no longer a sense of noise as a collective public health issue that we as a country should face and deal with, as complicated as it is. That's gone. I think it has just evolved into a very kind of siloed issue that makes it hard to talk about and really hard to fix.
Very true. So what do you think will be the future of the issue of noise in this country and beyond? One of the things that I think you mentioned in some of your people that you interviewed, they talk about, when you talk about, it's something similar to, we should be thinking about noise when we're designing buildings, when we're designing spaces. But they talk about, we should be thinking about what's coming next in terms of noise. And they talk about drones and the possible proliferation of drone usage and how that could contribute to the landscape. What do you think is the future of noise in this country and beyond? Do you see it improving? What will be some of the challenges you see in the future, whether it is new swarms of noise? Where are we going with this issue?
Tanya, that's a tough question. I would return to one of the first answers that I gave, which is noise is not just one problem. And so my thoughts are kind of divided based on, I think some noise, I'm very hopeful that we will see improvement in it. For instance, restaurants, there is a lot of pressure now being brought to bear to redesign restaurants with sound in mind. The Acoustic Society of America is going to come out with new guidelines for how restaurants could, if they want to, create these spaces where people can have conversations, for instance. There is movement in led by Europe really to think about noise beyond decibels, to have soundscape measurements, to be able to understand when we're going to build our or have infrastructure improvements in our city, to talk to people about the entirety of the sound environment as they're planning it out, and to include them in that, and to have some kind of tool like the thing I described with the restaurant to actually experience what that sound is going to be like. And then people can weigh in on whether that meets what their goals are as residents and users of that space. I think there's a lot of work being done for noise in hospitals with all the alarms that are going on, to redesign the alarm sounds, to change the ways that these many different patient monitors alert physicians to issues, even using AI to kind of see the patterns of the physiological signals from the patients and how many times that triggers an alarm that's actually not actionable, not worth the clinician's time. All those things I think are probably going to improve the technology and do pressure to kind of think about them upfront and proactively. I think though that there will be areas that, because we're not used to thinking about soundscape proactively, they're going to sneak up on us. You mentioned drones. Those are going to become much more prevalent. Everywhere that they have been tried, people worry about the privacy issues, they worry about the safety issues, but they viscerally hate the sound. The sound is like a electronic mosquito or something like that flying around, and you know, people threaten to shoot them out of the sky, and so but they're coming. There are going to be more and more of these things, and people are not thinking about, you know, for instance, what should be the route, the routing that we allow for them. Where should this is important, where should the depots be where they're going to come back to and get their packages and then return? You know, that's the sort of siting issue that typically would go, you know, oh, let's just put it in this neighborhood because they're not going to say no. And I think there's other issues that are just going to, you know, kind of be stasis because we have, you know, a world of 8 billion people. We live in close proximity. You know, I don't think we should aim to be in a noise-free world. I just think that is obviously impossible, but also the wrong goal to put out there, because people will say, what you're trying to say is you want me to shut up. And I think we need to marry this idea of understanding the threat with a proactive idea of possibly having, you know, the sounds in our world support our endeavors. You know, whether that's the healing in the hospital, the learning in the school, the restorative areas of our cities. We should have that as our goal as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to, you know, turn it over to people's questions. But did you have anything else that you'd like to read from your book before we do that? Any other another passage that you think stick out?
I had one more that I thought might be worth it. Let me just see. Okay, yeah. This is just a more practiced way of saying what I just tried to say, probably inarticulately. More fundamentally, we could ultimately bolster the anti-noise cause by expanding soundscape goals beyond quiet and recognizing other measures of sonic quality besides low decibels. When the anti-noise agenda is limited to saying no, stop it, and shut up, it becomes easier for people to dismiss concerns about noise as subjective grievances rather than a larger societal issue that we should tackle collectively and proactively with more consequential ends than alleviating individual annoyance and bother. We've seen how the neglect of sound helped noise take over the world, and we need to recognize that sounds matter. To care about chronic stress, distraction, sleep deprivation, patient safety, environmental justice, and habitat loss is to care about noise. So let's weave sound into broader conversations about all the big issues it touches. Yes, we should do more to protect ourselves from dangerous loudness and continue to practice common sense noise control, but let's marry those efforts with a more proactive, positive agenda for a shared world that is, after all, filled with and defined by sound. Sometimes we may want the world to shut up, but we ultimately want sonic environments that are more responsive to our needs. We want health and wellness. We want to feel safe, curious, joyful, and grounded. At times, we want to focus and be alone with our thoughts, but at others to connect with one another, to hear and be heard. Even though reality will inevitably fall short of our ideals, we can enlist sound in our efforts to create healthier buildings, restorative cities, and more resilient and equitable communities. What will these places look like? What will they sound like?
Okay, so we have one mic, but I'll come around and people raise their hand and I'll come around and give you the mic and then we'll get your responses to questions.
Thank you. That was super interesting. I have a very specific question. in the United States, we know that sirens sound like woo, woo, woo. And in Europe, they sound like And that second one is just as attention getting, but not nearly as jarring. Am I the only person who thinks that we should switch to that? And is there any research on why one is what it is and the other is what it is, and any kind of comparison about if one's more effective or whatever? Because I wonder about that. I spend a lot of time in Europe.
So there is no, well, not that I know of, I should say, specific research on why one is one and one is the other. But there are studies that have been done with the sounds of alerts, the sounds of, for instance, severe weather alerts that were issued by different, the Weather Channel had one, I think a different app had another one. And there was a study done by a group, now I'm forgetting the name of them, to compare the reactions that people had to these different sounds. And one of them was super jarring and, very loud and strident. And the other, people actually, when they didn't know what it was, they rated it very pleasant and easy to listen to, I should say. But when they learned what it was, they were able to react in the same ways, because people learn by association what the sounds mean. You've heard some sounds of flooding or natural disasters. I think in Japan, I saw some video clips of these things. You would think it's, I don't know, like the end of the school day or something. These things are so foreign to us, but because people are used to understanding what a sound is related to, they are able to respond to it. Now, the volume here in the States of sirens, the loudness of them has increased over the years, just to get above the background. And I think it's spot checks, but in turn of the century, 1900 to the 20th century, they were about 96 decibels from 10 feet away. And then in 1970s, they were measured at about 114 decibels. And then most recently, somebody saw those two and they measured them again, and they were like 118 or 120 decibels. That's the kind of decibels that will, instantly damage your hearing if you're next to it. So that's a partial answer to it.
Absolutely.
Hi, I'm in touch with a guy who's actually doing research on how to control ambulance sirens. And I've been looking for his emails. I can't find it at the moment. But he's trying to develop a process by which the sound would only be directed straight ahead, and that so that it would not go high up into people's apartments.
Yeah.
And so he's been testing it out on an ambulance loaned to him, I guess, by Mount Sinai. His first experiment didn't work, but he's still at it, and he sent me the status. So maybe he'll see.
Any thoughts on that? Like this one?
Well, I do hope I'm wondering, where is he doing the research?
But he was in New York,
Yeah.
but then now he's out in California.
Okay. I mean, this is a slightly different issue, but we're used to certain sound environments. Just we get habituated to them because that's the way they are. But I don't know if anyone's ever been in a silent or quiet airport. Anyone? Okay. They're amazing. They're in typical airport, you've got the crosstalk of every little announcement about a gate change or somebody's lost watch or what have you. That's blasted over this kind of crackly PA system, and it's this constant kind of jabbering noise. And there's a number of airports in Europe, also in Asia, and in San Francisco is one of them, that they now just, only if it's, boarding announcements, they'll have those. Other things, they will have the better signage. They also have, they know that people are getting these notifications by their phones. So it gets pushed to that. And, it's an amazing experience to be in one of these places, and you just have to find other ways of communicating what you're trying to communicate, but it is possible.
Hi, did you come across much research to do with gender and perception of sound and perception of what noise is? And also, yeah, I just wondered if that was something that you had researched or come across.
It's gonna be a short answer. I didn't actually.
Oh.
There are many differences in sound sensitivities. Obviously, the ones that I saw were they were dealing with people who have neurodiversity, autism, that sort of thing. I didn't see anything dealing with gender. I don't know if anybody else has seen. Yeah.
So I actually had a early experience of this from New Zealand, and when I was 15, my friend and I did a science fair project where we measured the loudness inside truck cabs. We did a whole scientific study. We borrowed, dB measures, and all the truck drivers were men, and most of them did not wear hearing protection, even though the government required that they did. And it was really, we felt it was a gender issue. This was back 70s, right? Okay. So to me, I've always noticed this is part of my perception is that it's part of the whole joy thing, and noise and sound, and power. Sound is power, and I just would love somebody to be doing some studies on that, because it seems to be part of what's keeping things stuck.
Yeah.
So.
That would be interesting to look into. It is part of, I guess, a masculine idea that you shouldn't be bothered by noise. You just should, in fact, make more noise to, project your power. And there are many more men in some of the industries that are the loudest. And there's not great adherence to hearing protection. There's an audiologist that I met who was able to get more people in industry to wear hearing protection by asking them what their favorite sound is, by having them reflect on sounds in their lives that actually matter to them, to kind of value their hearing. And not be caught up in sort of the, macho idea that you shouldn't even, this is just grin and bear it, it's work, it's just part of life. But you're gonna miss out on some of these things that you love to hear. This one person loved to fly fish. His favorite sound was hearing the kiss of the fish when it caught the lure and was, he got it out of the water. She said, you're gonna lose that. You're not gonna be able to have that in your life if you don't start protecting your ears. But the larger issue would be worth looking into.
I also say I loved in the book when you talked about the weaponizing of noise, and it was like military and tough, the ways in which that was done to punish, to actually torture, right? Yeah. People.
Yeah.
So yeah.
The LRAD. Oh yeah. So I write about noise weapons, and there's a big divide between sort of, I guess, conspiracies about noise weapons and actual noise weapons. I think there has been a lot of interest in direct impacts of sound, like infrasound, which is the sound below what we can hear. that might be able to, you know, essentially jiggle our insides like a wine glass, you know, from a high pitched sound, and melt our viscera. There's been a lot of kind of sensation. If you remember the sonic attack in Havana, Cuba, how many months that was headline news. This idea that, you know, sound will just be directed at you and you know, be weaponized in that way. The way that it has been weaponized is by loudness, straight up. There's a thing called the long range acoustic device, which was developed by the Navy to drive away terrorists from warships. And it can be, I think, about 160 decibels. This is the kind of sound that will instantly rupture your eardrum. And it's been, the surplus LRADs have been adopted by local law enforcement to be used as crowd control devices. Some of these are, you know, slightly lower power than the military ones, but they can still cause permanent hearing damage if they are, you know, used on people. And I think there was I know there was a lawsuit against the NYPD on this from the protests, the Eric Garner protests. The NYPD now can only use the LRAD for making, you know, crowd control announcements. They can no longer use what's called the deterrent tone, which is the super powerful one. Yeah, so it is used to weaponize.
Very compelling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I've been to Woodstock Festival. I go to Jazzmobile. I go to Summer Stage in the Park. All of these things are not in front of where people live. I live on Broadway in Dyckman, which is right by Castillo Plaza, which blasts super loud music at unbearable levels, and there's very little that can be done about it. I mean, at this point, I realized that I need to find, like, probably a law firm that will sue the people who are doing it, because it's just you know, it's part of the corruption of the city, part of the corruption of the mayor and stuff. So it's just very, very difficult. It's super, super loud. And I love amplified music. I love good hi-fi music and stuff. But it's just super, super loud. So when windows are closed, it's like 95 dBs inside.
Yeah.
And just if anyone has any suggestions of law firms that might helpful in these things, that would be of interest. Thank you.
Would you like any response?
I would say just a couple things. Because this should really, I think Tanya will have more insightful things to say on this, but, you know, groups like hers, where people, and like yours, where people are able to share these stories, not just the stories, but collect data and share that data is very important, very powerful to, I talked to some people at a group called Quiet Communities, which some of you may know, and there's no getting around it. Many of these issues are just going to be slogs. They are going to feel like impossible because of some of the things we talked about with the lack of understanding at a local level of how to deal with these issues, the lack of belief by the authorities that it is worth enforcing. And so collecting that evidence is vital. Making that that reasonable case to the people that should be able to do something about it. Maybe it's the Parks Department, or maybe it's the police, or maybe it's you know, whatever governing authority. This is another thing with noise in the city. It could be in the inspector's office. It could be the police department. It might be the Parks Department. It could be the state, depending on which road you're talking about. But anyway, making that reasonable case, collecting that evidence, can either help remedy the problem, and if it doesn't, it can be used, as you mentioned, in litigation. But I don't have a ton more to say on that. I don't know if Tanya has more.
Just that I agree.
And me too.
I just want to update the question about the European style sirens because I've had this murky stuff in my brain from a few years ago. So around 2019 or so, elected leader in New York City, Helen Rosenthal, worked on, sponsored a project where Mount Sinai Health System ended up using the European style sirens. Most people liked it. I think people can look this up. And more recently, 2023, Gail Brewer and Carlina Rivera were sponsoring a similar bill. So I don't know the outcome of that. I do know that some people found the European style sirens disturbing because they reminded them of earlier, yes, yeah, Nazi occupation from much earlier. So it's interesting to look up. I'm sorry, I can't really say this more eloquently, but there were a lot of people working on this. You could say there was research done if it was actually research.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That'd be great. Yeah. Thank you for making me aware.
I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for, coming here and also thank you for writing. I don't know if people are aware that you write this monthly Substack, which is kind of where my question is coming from, and back to what you were saying about gathering data, just because in your current issue, you talk about the people you're interviewing, you're talking about how difficult it is to gather substantive evidence that will stand up. Say, my neighbor here wants to sue somebody. I wonder if you ever found any situation where citizens could be empowered to gather that data that then would help them, whether it's through litigation or just through community action, actually, move the needle on convincing public, officials to do something about a situation in the community, because it's complicated, right? When here in New York, and Tanya and anybody else who's in our group or coalition will know that the barriers to actually convincing, the city's Department of Environmental Protection that some condition exists are so high because they insist on coming out themselves. And if something's happening now and you gather evidence, whether it's through any of these, phone-based apps, it's not enough.
Yeah.
So back to my question, have you found anywhere in your research where they've succeeded, where communities have succeeded in actually empowering themselves to be able to convince people?
I have not found communities that have quote unquote solved their neighborhood noise issues. I have found places like in Seattle where they've been able to get some traction at the state level with the Port Authority that runs the airport, with the local parks department to do various things to help mitigate the noise in their neighborhood. I have talked to the people in Detroit, partnered with the University of Michigan to gather evidence. This is, often a necessary thing for communities to have that kind of bona fides, in their corner. I have talked to, I know Erica Walker, I know her pretty well now, and she works with these groups in Jackson, Mississippi, and surrounding areas to actually train people how to use the noise meters properly, like where you have to make the measurements for how long, because they won't. If you're going to use the evidence, it can't just be, at one point in time I measured it at 95 decibels. People are going to want to see a length of measurement to kind of see, this is the actual conditions under which you are trying to live your life. So the short answer is I haven't found kind of a success story really large, but I have seen people who have made any progress in this doing those things where they are finding appropriate partners, broadening the issue, and training how to use these measurement devices.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
you found universities particularly useful in terms of resources if you're gathering evidence and that kind of thing? I'm just thinking for us locally, I don't know if this is a great idea or not, but Columbia, for example, with its vast resources, could be a source of something. Much to say about that, but you know, there are so many well-equipped science gathering place, or even the Presbyterian in the hospital, right, system. I mean, they have all this equipment sitting there. I know they do. Go ahead.
Well, Tanya can speak to this, which Tanya was working with Columbia on a research project that was funded by the federal government.
Yes, thank you. So yes, the WaHI-Inwood Task Force Noise, part of Columbia's Graduate School of Public Health, on a study about the impact of noise on sleep health in Washington Heights and Inwood. We had done we had a launching event. We had gathered all of the subjects for the study and were ready to begin. And then Donald Trump was elected, and the funding was taken away. So we don't know whether that funding will be restored with the deal that Columbia has now made. We don't know. We're waiting to hear, trying to find out. But this is what we mean about how, vulnerable, a lot of these community efforts are to the powers that be, and how things can change overnight. So we really are hoping to still do that stuff. Bona fides are very important. It's important to have data. It's important to be able to have something when you're advocating for change that you can have, evidence that this is a problem. So yes.
I'll say one thing on this. Typically, the National Institutes of Health is a huge source of money to fund studies. They could be funding studies on noise impacts on health, but they don't think about noise as an environmental determinant of health. And so a lot of researchers have had they're studying something else, and then they'll throw some noise questions into the questionnaire, or they'll tack on a little side issue where they'll have some decibel meters around. And so it's sort of playing second fiddle to what is actually well funded and regarded, environmental health research.
And I would also say that, we should seriously, as a community, continue to advocate for noise to be part of the Commission on Environmental Justice, the newly created commission, that is recognized as such. So, that's another thing that I think we could do as a community to make sure that it's on that agenda, because it's not on the agenda. So, any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is such an interesting topic that I'm just now learning a little bit more about. I guess one question, maybe a two-part question, but I was working at a state senator's office in Bay Ridge, and a lot of that community had issues with private airplanes flying over and going to Long Island to their houses in the Hamptons and things like that. And it was a recurring issue down there, so much so that the office knew all of the constituents that had issues, had already contacted letters to the FAA, and they were just kind of there are rich people who want to go to the Hamptons, they're going to go to the Hamptons, we're not going to tell them they can't. And so I'm wondering, with something like this and something like the truck issue, even of having truck drivers needing to go around the highway so they can make their deliveries on time, that's almost like a labor law thing too. So yeah, not a very concrete question here, but kind of interested in your take of all of these intersections of labor and I guess the capitalism aspect of it. How do we get around that? That's supposed to be the individualism and the capitalism of it all. How do we try to get around that? Or what is your take on that? That makes any sense.
Yeah, that's a very, to get around it, that's the tricky part, right? If you think about when the COVID hush happened, when that they were spot checking the decibel levels in different cities, and they went down about 4 to 6 decibels depending where they looked. And okay, 4 to 6 decibels. Think about the number of businesses that closed, the number of jobs that were lost, the number of people that got sick and died. That was the backdrop to that. To think about how much, if you were going to just stop commerce or halt capitalism to achieve a sonic end, to me that's a sort of a non-starter. I feel like a better way to go about it is to understand when you are placing your highway somewhere, when you are, for instance, in Vancouver, the port has voluntary slowdowns for ships coming through, that they also will reward these ships for being green. Now, green could be, low emissions. It could be not dumping your trash out in the middle of the ocean. It could be that you have quieter propulsion systems, and they will pay or give you a break on your docking fee. I think there are sort of carrots that could be brought to bear to kind of promote some of this stuff, and more thoughtful planning on where these very noisy things that we all depend on are placed. In Detroit, now they are trying to come up with a new truck routing ordinance. And it's tricky because if you take all those trucks that are going through Thomasini and Weston's front yard, and you then say, oh, well, we're going to put them in this other person's front yard. Yeah. So they're sort of saying, well, maybe what we'll do is we'll put like big speed bumps, or we'll redesign the intersections so that these trucks don't want to use the residential streets to bypass. So you have to be, I think, creative, but it starts by being aware that this is an issue, and I think that's lacking.
Any other question?
Just a little statement. There are a couple of Japanese style music bars in New York, which are, they have hi-fi equipment to die for, basically. So I went to one, and they're just blasting stuff so loud that people couldn't talk. I don't think that's how they do it in Japan, but when it comes to New York, it sort of happens like that.
But this is funny because this didn't make it into the book, but it wasn't part of a magazine piece I did prior to the book. Because when I went to India, I was meeting with a noise activist there who, one of the issues, besides the honking and the traffic noise, are the street festivals. And this is a very tricky issue because these street festivals are, culturally prized, various, either in Hinduism or in Islam, or there's a couple Christian ones, but they're like all over the place. The one that that I was there for, it was the Ganesh Festival. This is a multi-day festival of honoring the birth of, it's like a birthday party for the elephant god with the many arms. And the thing is that it used to be, under 50 years ago, a private festival, a private celebration that families would do in their homes. And then at the end of it, they still do this, they would immerse the Ganesh idol in water. And then it became public because it was a cover for the anti-colonial groups that would kind of use this as a way to get together and bypass the restrictions on congregating and assembling. So now you had people doing this in public, and it was still pretty quiet. But then you had amplification. So now there are these DJs that were put into the floats when the Ganesh comes through town, and they are connected to these political groups. So every political group has a Ganesh idol and a parade, and the way that they show, how powerful they are is to have the loudest parade. And so this is one of those things where you look at a cultural practice in its long scope and say, loudness is not the essence of it. It's just part of how it's evolved now. It's part of how it's practiced for any number of different reasons. And so this woman who I met, she was able to get the local government in Mumbai to do two things: ban amplified music during the Ganesh festival. So there's still the traditional musicians, but no more kind of DJs having a disco. Keeping the music stopped at like 1 a.m. or something like that. And when I went there, what's funny is the music does stop at 1 a.m. But the people that keep making noise are the politicians that are up on stage haranguing everybody, with their loudspeakers. It was quite funny.
Okay, awesome story. Any other questions? Oopsie.
I want to go back to trucks. And I think it should be noted that probably in the cut running for the Washington Heights, connecting the GW Bridge to the Cross Bronx Expressway. And I fear for there are four tall apartment buildings that straddle this Trans-Manhattan Expressway. And I fear for the people who live in those apartments. I don't know how they could possibly tolerate it, how they survive over the years. And I don't know if any research has ever been done as to the noise and air pollution impact on the people in those the four bridge apartment buildings. But it's but if you're going to talk about trucks, we have the busiest truck route in the country, running right through Washington Heights into the Bronx.
If I could quickly say something.
Many years ago, I read about an educational study. They did not say it was those buildings, but it had to be those buildings because it matched it exactly. And they compared children living on the really upper floors and children living on the lowest. And there was a definite, yes, there was a definite disparity. That's without any, it's the same buildings. So there's no other difference they could say. And they probably all went to the same schools or almost all of them. And it had that effect. So there we have it.
I have one more thing to say on that, because you may know that one of the seminal studies of noise as an environmental hazard in the 70s was done in Inwood. So you know about this. It's the school that it was Arlene Bronzaft was part of that research group.
Yes,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Inwood. But yeah, okay, you know all about it. I mean,
Everybody knows our.
Noise nerds.
A little bit of regional.
Everybody knows about it.
Sure. So
but it's actually a success story
it is.
because she succeeded in getting the subway line to change in order to reduce the noise emanating from the subway trains crossing next to the school.
Exactly. No, she says she describes it as a miracle.
Yeah.
That she got the subway lines to put some padding on the tracks to soften that sound, and then she got the Department of Education to put sound absorption in the classrooms. In addition, so the first research that they did looked at classrooms on the noisy side and on the quiet side, and found huge discrepancies in terms of reading levels and math achievement on the noisy side. Subsequent to getting these miracles, they redid the studies and found that everyone had caught up to each other.
So we're going to transition now to thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. And thank you, Chris, for your great anecdotes and responding to those questions and giving us some more information and education on this issue. But we wanted to transition to the book signing part of this event. But before we go, before we do that, we want to make sure that you all know that you can of course, reach Chris at www.chrisberdik.com. And as you mentioned, he has a Substack. Please check that out. And also, if you're interested in learning more or joining the noise task force here, there is a form that you can fill out, a sign-up sheet there if you want to learn more about us. But please join us for the book signing. We're going to take a transitional moment here to set that up, and then we can get going with that. And Chris, would you like to close us out with any closing thoughts?
Only to thank everybody for coming out today. It really means a lot to have folks interested enough to take some of their evening to join me and talk about this issue. One of the big things that I struggled with while I was writing this thing for felt like a decade was, who's going to care about this? Am I going to be able to convince people that this matters? And to have folks come out